at Patru Cincisprzecia, M. on September 19th. Flight Sergeant William Hastings pressed his bare hand against a splintered fuselage at RAF Marham in the European theatre. He was crouching in the damp darkness beneath the massive port wing of a de Havilland Mosquito B Merc 4. The cold autumn air smelled sharply of high-octane aviation fuel and damp sawdust. Squadron leader Thomas Reynolds, 24 years old, 38 heavy bomber missions, 0 kills. In exactly 4 hours, he would face a swarm of 50 Luftwaffe Focke Wulf 190 interceptors over occupied Europe in an aircraft entirely devoid of defensive armor, plating or heavy machine guns. The Mosquito was a mechanical marvel of the modern age. It housed twin supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin 21 engines. Each engine generated a staggering 460 horsepower. It carried a 2,000-pound high-explosive payload deep into heavily defended enemy territory. But it had one fatal problem. The entire airframe was constructed almost exclusively from wood. A single jagged hole from enemy anti-aircraft shrapnel could instantly compromise the structural integrity of the entire stressed-skin fuselage. Air Ministry doctrine was absolute. Never attempt structural wood repairs on the front line. Use only factory-certified replacement sections. Don't risk high-speed delamination under combat stress. Hastings had tried that doctrine 4 times in the past month. It hadn't worked. Grounding a damaged bomber to wait for specialized factory transport kept the aircraft out of the war for 45 days. The bomber squadron simply could not afford the wait. In the last 21 days alone, the Royal Air Force had lost 92 heavy metal bombers over the skies of Germany. 644 men were gone. The massive aluminum Sterlings and Halifaxes were heavily armed, but they were far too slow. They maxed out at 250 miles per hour, making them easy, lumbering prey for German radar-guided flak batteries and night fighters. When they were intercepted and systematically destroyed, the official inquiry boards repeatedly stamped the exact same phrase on the typed casualty reports. Loss of aircraft due to pilot error. The Mosquito was specifically designed to bypass this industrial-scale slaughter. Its secret lay in a radical balsa wood and birch plywood sandwich construction. The main fuselage shell consisted of a 3/8-inch Ecuadorian balsa wood core. This soft, lightweight core was pressed tightly between 2 outer layers of 3-ply Canadian birch veneer. Each birch layer measured just 3/32 of an inch thick. The wooden layers were bonded together in heated concrete molds, using highly toxic urea formaldehyde and strong casein adhesives. The result was a glass, smooth exterior shell. There were no overlapping heavy metal plates. There were no drag-inducing steel rivets. The aerodynamically flawless surface slipped right through the air, completely eliminating the microscopic friction that crippled traditional heavy bombers. But Mosquito DZ-353 had taken a 1/4-inch flak laceration to its aft fuselage during a low-level sweep over France. The internal balsa core was exposed to the freezing moisture. Hastings had shown the damaged airframe and the daily maintenance log to Engineering Officer Davies. Davies had crossed his arms and shaken his head. The damage exceeds what is within specifications, Davies stated coldly. A field patch is completely outside factory tolerances. It will void the warranty of the airworthiness certificate. There is no authorization for frontline carpentry on a combat aircraft. The primary de Havilland production factory at Hatfield was 72 miles away. The bomber was officially grounded for 6 weeks. Hastings, a master civilian cabinet maker before the war, ignored the officer's ruling. He waited until 0130 a.m., when the hangars went completely dark and quiet. He requisitioned a 1/6-inch slab of high-grade birch from a destroyed engine shipping crate. He used a standard steel block plane to painstakingly shave the wood to a precise 4-degree curve. He mixed exactly 6 ounces of industrial casein wood glue in a rusted tin cup. He fitted the curved patch perfectly over the jagged flak wound. He secured it directly to the surrounding healthy wood using 18 brass screws, spaced exactly 0.5 inches apart. He applied exactly 160 pounds of clamping tension using heavy iron clamps. The entire illegal install took exactly 47 minutes. He sanded the seam down to a 0mm tolerance, making it invisible to the naked eye. He painted over the raw wood grain with standard RAF ocean grey camouflage dope. Nobody noticed. At the 0500 a.m. pre-flight inspection, the ranking officers only checked the aluminum engine cowlings. They checked the hydraulic fluid lines and the rubber tire pressure. They signed the yellow maintenance log without a second glance at the patched tail boom. Squadron leader Reynolds climbed into the freezing cockpit. Completely unaware his plane was held together by shipping crate, scrap and civilian furniture glue. The twin Merlin engines roared to life, vibrating the wooden airframe. What happened in the next 120 minutes would change the European air war forever. A Cinchtreya M. Mosquito DZ 353 lifted off the wet tarmac at RAF Murrum. The twin Merlin engines hauled the wooden airframe to an altitude of 24,000 feet. Inside the freezing cockpit, Squadron leader Thomas Reynolds watched his airspeed indicator climb. The needle pushed past 360 miles per hour. He was flying deep into hostile German airspace. Down on the ground, Flight Sergeant Hastings sat alone in the damp hangar. He stared down at the yellow maintenance log. He knew exactly what happened when high-altitude moisture penetrated compromised balsa wood. The freezing temperatures turned the trapped water into expanding ice. The ice violently separated the fragile birch layers from the inside out. Hastings had memorized the previous casualty reports. On August 14, Flight Lieutenant John Vance flew a Mosquito with minor, unrepaired tail damage. Atop Sprzeche, 0 feet over Lilla. Vance radioed base. He reported a heavy, mushy lag in the elevator controls. 3 minutes later, the aircraft's tail section catastrophically delaminated at 320 miles per hour. Both crew members were killed instantly. The Air Ministry Inquiry Board reviewed the shattered wreckage. They issued a standard ruling in the official files. Loss of aircraft due to pilot error. 3 weeks later, on September 2, Pilot Officer David Croft encountered the exact same fatal flaw. He was flying at 22,000 feet near Bremen. Croft noted a sudden aerodynamic lag on his starboard wing after flying through heavy rain. The moisture had seeped into an unsealed factory seam. The wooden wing tore itself apart during a high-speed evasive dive. The official engineering report blamed Croft entirely. Airframe structural failure occurred within spec limits. Loss due to pilot error. Now, Reynolds was pushing an illegally patched airframe straight toward the heavily defended Ruhr Valley. The outside air temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. If Hastings' unauthorized casein glue failed, the 1/6-inch birch patch would instantly rip off. The sudden aerodynamic drag would tear the wooden fuselage in half. At Chase Patrozet Schichincha, M. German radar operators at Düsseldorf spotted the lone British bomber. They scrambled 4 Focke Wulf 190 interceptors. The FW 190 was the absolute pride of the Luftwaffe. It boasted a massive 700 horsepower radial engine. It carried 4 deadly 20mm automatic cannons. It was widely considered the most feared heavy metal fighter in the world. At Doazech Shishasse, 000 feet. The German flight leader spotted the unarmed Mosquito. He pushed his throttle to maximum combat power. He closed the lethal distance to just 800 yards. Reynolds saw the enemy fighters growing larger in his rear-view mirror. He had no heavy machine guns to return fire. He had no steel armored plating to stop the explosive shells. Standard bomber doctrine dictated a shallow dive and evasive weaving. Reynolds ignored the official doctrine. He shoved the twin-engine throttles completely forward. He pushed the manifold pressure to a staggering 54 inches. The wooden bomber surged forward through the thin air. The airspeed indicator hit 392 miles per hour. The German flight leader was stunned. His advanced, all-metal FW 190 was redlining at 385 miles per hour. He was actually losing ground to a twin-engine bomber. The smooth, rivetless exterior of the Mosquito generated almost zero aerodynamic drag. Hastings' glued wooden patch held perfectly flush against the fuselage. It maintained the aircraft's flawless slipstream under immense pressure. The 18 brass screws did not buckle. Reynolds felt absolutely no mushy lag in the control stick. The aircraft responded with razor-sharp precision. The German interceptors chased the wooden bomber for 45 desperate miles. They never got within firing range. Adopt Durchbrecher. M. Reynolds crossed safely back over the English Channel. He had successfully photographed 3 vital German munitions factories. He had completely outrun the fastest, deadliest fighters in the Luftwaffe. Adopt Durchbrecher. M. Mosquito DZ-353 touched down at RAF Marham. The rubber tires screeched sharply against the concrete. Reynolds taxied the aircraft back to the damp hangar. Hastings was waiting on the tarmac with the yellow maintenance log tight in his hands. He watched the massive 1-2-foot propellers spin to a halt. He walked directly to the aft fuselage. He ran his bare hand over the 1/6-inch birch patch. The casein glue had cured to a rock-hard finish under the extreme engine heat. The seam was completely intact. Reynolds climbed down the wooden boarding ladder. He pulled off his leather flight helmet. He looked directly at the civilian cabinet maker. "I pushed her past 390, Reynolds said quietly. "She flew cleaner than she did off the factory floor." Engineering Officer Davies walked out of the command hut. He carried a steel inspection clipboard in his right hand. He was marching straight toward the aft section of the bomber. He was actively looking for the unrepaired 1/4-inch flak damage. Hastings quickly stepped in front of the modified fuselage. He held his breath as the strict officer raised his pen. Adopt Durchbrecher. M. Engineering Officer Davies stopped exactly 3 feet from the aft fuselage of Mosquito DZ-353. He held his heavy steel clipboard up. Hastings shifted his left shoulder. He subtly blocked the precise 1/6-inch area where the devastating flak hole used to be. Squadron leader Reynolds immediately stepped between the 2 men. He thrust the yellow maintenance log directly into the officer's hands. "Aircraft performed flawlessly," Reynolds stated flatly. "Zero aerodynamic lag. Engine performance is perfectly within spec." Davies lowered his pen. He checked the typed forms for the port engine oil pressure. He inspected the 2/4-volt electrical system readings. He did not touch the fresh ocean grey camouflage paint on the tail boom. He stamped the official log and walked away. The bomber was officially cleared for combat. The secret did not stay with Hastings. By mid-October 1942, RAF Marham faced a crippling aircraft shortage. 14 Mosquito bombers sat paralyzed on the wet tarmac. They all suffered from minor structural wood damage caused by German shrapnel. They were officially grounded for the mandatory 4-5-day factory transport. The squadron was bleeding operational capability. Hastings knew the heavy metal bombers were still dying by the dozens. He gathered 4 other civilian-trained mechanics in a damp Nissen hut. They formed an illegal, underground carpentry ring right under the noses of RAF command. They smuggled 50 pounds of raw Ecuadorian balsa wood onto the military base. They secured 20 pints of industrial casein glue. They hid the contraband materials inside empty 500-gallon aviation fuel drums to evade routine barracks inspections. The covert operation worked entirely between 0100 AM and 0400 AM. The mechanics used dim, red lens flashlights to avoid detection. They applied the precise 4 degree curved patches to shattered wingtips and punctured tail fins. They used basic hand saws, steel block planes, and heavy iron clamps. One mechanic severely sliced his thumb on a splintered birch panel. Bleeding over the tarmac, he quietly wrapped it in an oily rag and kept sanding. They sanded every single wooden seam down to a 0mm tolerance. They painted over the raw wood before the sun came up. Post-war unit reports noted an inexplicable, massive drop in grounded aircraft during this exact 3-week window. Squadron turnaround times magically plummeted from 45 days to just 12 hours. Within 3 weeks, 18 illegally patched Mosquitoes were flying deep penetration missions over Germany. The numbers on the front line violently shifted. The wooden bombers were flying 2,000-pound payloads straight into the heart of the Third Reich. They were taking heavy anti-aircraft fire over the Ruhr Valley. Jagged steel shrapnel routinely pierced the balsa wood hulls, but the planes did not go down. The lightweight timber sandwich design absorbed the kinetic impacts without triggering catastrophic metal fatigue. The aircraft simply refused to shatter, and thanks to Hastings's midnight patches, the compromised airframes held together flawlessly at 390 miles per hour. German radar operators watched their screens in total disbelief. The British bombers were consistently outrunning the 1,700 horsepower Focke Wulf, 190 interceptors. The Luftwaffe could not catch them. They could not shoot them down. At 1400 hours on November 14, inside the heavily guarded Ministry of Aviation in Berlin, Luftwaffe Commander Hermann Göring sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was staring at a classified interception report. The typed document detailed the exact airspeed and loss ratios of the new British bomber. In the last 30 days, German fighter squadrons had attempted exactly 42 interceptions of the wooden aircraft. They had achieved 0 confirmed kills. Göring's face flushed red with rage. Germany possessed the most advanced metallurgical industry on the planet. They built their formidable war machines from scarce, highly refined aluminum and steel alloys, yet the most elusive, advanced, and indestructible fast bomber in the sky was essentially flying wooden furniture. Göring slammed his heavy fist down onto the intelligence report. He demanded to know how the British were keeping these fragile planes in the air without advanced industrial repair yards. He ordered his top aeronautical engineers to capture one of the aircraft intact. At that exact moment, 600 miles away in England, a Ministry of Aircraft production inspector stepped out of a black staff car at RAF Marham. He carried a leather briefcase packed with official factory repair quotas. He held a master copy of the base's yellow maintenance logs. The numbers from RAF Marham simply did not add up. The factory had not shipped a single replacement tail boom to the base in 30 days, yet 18 damaged bombers were flying daily sorties. The inspector walked directly toward the damp Nissen hut, where the civilian mechanics slept. He pulled a flashlight from his heavy wool coat. At 1402 hours on November 14, Inspector Arthur Pendleton stepped into the cold Nissen hut. He switched on his heavy brass flashlight. The beam of light cut sharply through the damp air. 5 civilian mechanics were fast asleep on narrow steel cots. They had just finished a brutal midnight shift. Pendleton walked slowly toward the back of the corrugated iron room. He stopped in front of 3 empty 500-gallon aviation fuel drums. He unlatched the heavy steel lid of the first drum. He did not smell the sharp, highly volatile fumes of high-octane aviation fuel. He smelled the unmistakable chemical odor of industrial urea formaldehyde. Pendleton reached his gloved hand deep inside the hollow steel drum. He pulled out a perfectly curved 16-inch slab of unpainted Ecuadorian balsa wood. He pulled out 2 large glass jars of commercial casein furniture glue. He pulled out a heavy iron C-clamp and a steel block plane. Pendleton opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out the master copy of the base's yellow maintenance logs. He ran his index finger down the typed column of aircraft serial numbers. 18 Mosquito bombers were currently marked as combat-ready, but the primary de Havilland factory at Hatfield had shipped exactly 0 replacement wooden panels to RAF Maham in the last 30 days. At 1430 hours, Pendleton summoned Engineering Officer Davies and Flight Sergeant Hastings to the centre of the main hangar. Pendleton placed the raw balsa wood and the jars of furniture glue directly onto a steel workbench. He dropped the 18 yellow maintenance logs next to the contraband materials. These aircraft are illegally modified, Pendleton stated flatly. You have completely bypassed official factory tolerances. You have voided the airworthiness certificates of 18 frontline combat bombers. Every single one of these aircraft is permanently grounded as of this exact minute. Engineering Officer Davies remained completely silent. Flight Sergeant Hastings looked directly at the inspector. If you ground those 18 planes today, we lose our entire deep strike capability over the Ruhr Valley. Hastings said, we go back to sending slow metal bombers to Germany. We go back to losing 15% of our crews on every single mission. The de Havilland factory is 72 miles away. They take 45 days to ship a new tail boom. We fix the fatal damage in 47 minutes. Pendleton shook his head. Standard Air Ministry doctrine strictly forbids frontline structural carpentry. Pendleton replied, it is a severe military offence. At 1510 hours, a loud and violent sputtering roar echoed across the wet tarmac. The base air raid siren began to wail. Squadron leader Reynolds was returning from a low-level reconnaissance sweep over Bremen. Mosquito DZ-353 was dropping fast through the thick grey clouds. Only the port-side Merlin 21 engine was running. The starboard propeller was completely feathered and dead. Reynolds hit the damp concrete runway hard at exactly 130 miles per hour. The rubber tires smoked violently as the damaged bomber skidded toward the main hangar. Pendleton, Davies, and Hastings ran out onto the cold tarmac. They reached the smoking aircraft just as Reynolds killed the remaining one. 460 horsepower engine. The starboard wing had taken a direct, catastrophic hit from German 20mm flak. A massive 3-foot section of the outer wing was completely missing. The internal balsa wood core was shattered and splintered into hundreds of pieces. But Pendleton walked past the destroyed wing. He stared closely at the aft fuselage. He checked the serial number on his yellow maintenance log. This was the exact aircraft Hastings had illegally patched 56 days earlier. The 16-inch birch repair on the tail boom had sustained a glancing blow from flying steel shrapnel. If this had been a traditional heavy metal bomber, the sheer aerodynamic stress of a single engine return flight would have buckled the aluminum frame. The intense metal fatigue would have sheared the heavy steel rivets. The tail section would have torn completely off at 300 miles per hour, just like the fatal pilot error reports from August had described. But the glued wooden patch had simply flexed and absorbed the massive kinetic energy. The 18 brass screws had held the timber sandwich perfectly tight. The 16-inch birch patch had successfully maintained the aircraft's flawless aerodynamic slipstream. The plane had survived a 400-mile flight across the freezing North Sea on one engine. It was held together by a civilian cabinet maker's illegal furniture glue. Reynolds climbed slowly down the wooden boarding ladder. He was covered in sweat and dark hydraulic fluid. He looked directly at the inspector from the Ministry of Aircraft Production. She took a 20mm shell directly to the wing at 18,000 feet. Reynolds reported. I put her into a 390-mile-per-hour dive to escape 2 Focke Wulf 190 interceptors. The airframe did not shudder once. The flight controls never went mushy. Pendleton looked back down at his stack of 18 yellow maintenance logs. He looked at the raw wooden patch holding the world's fastest bomber together. He had to make an immediate choice between enforcing official British military doctrine and winning the air war over Europe. Pendleton slowly opened his leather briefcase and pulled out his heavy official brass ministry stamp. What he did next would change the entire industrial strategy of the Royal Air Force forever. At 1512 hours on November 14, Itenjobai Sishar, Inspector Arthur Pendleton stood motionless on the freezing concrete tarmac at RAF Marham. He held the heavy brass Ministry of Aircraft Production stamp tightly in his right hand. He looked directly at the splintered, catastrophic 3-foot hole in the starboard wing of Mosquito DZ-353. He looked at the perfectly intact 1/6-inch birch patch on the aft fuselage. He looked down at his master stack of 18 yellow maintenance logs. Pendleton finally made his decision. He did not ground the 18 illegally modified bombers. He did not arrest Flight Sergeant Hastings for military insubordination. Instead, Pendleton placed the yellow maintenance log flat against the cold steel fuselage of a nearby aviation fuel truck. He pressed the heavy brass stamp down hard in dark blue ink. He officially certified the contraband civilian carpentry as a vital, field expedient combat repair. The consequences of that single ink stamp violently shifted the entire industrial timeline of the European Air War. By December 1942, the British Air Ministry completely rewrote their rigid structural maintenance doctrine. They entirely stopped shipping damaged wooden bombers 72 miles back to the primary Hatfield factory. The de Havilland Corporation immediately began mass-producing official frontline repair kits. These kits were reverse-engineered directly from Hastings' illegal contraband stash. Each standardized kit contained pre-cut Ecuadorian balsa wood blanks and 3-ply Canadian birch veneers. They included exact blueprints for the 4-degree curve, 2-inch brass screws, and heavy iron clamps. Most importantly, they included sealed glass jars of industrial casein wood glue. By early 1943, over 400 civilian cabinet makers, carpenters, and piano builders were drafted directly into frontline RAF maintenance squadrons. Mechanics no longer hid in damp Nissan huts with red lens flashlights. They openly applied 160 pounds of clamping pressure in broad daylight. They sanded the seams to 0mm tolerances right on the active flight line. The squadron operational turnaround time permanently plummeted from a paralyzing 45 days to under 12 hours. The numbers shifted massively in favor of the Allied bombing campaign. The Royal Air Force eventually mass-produced 781 de Havilland Mosquitoes. These wooden marvels carried heavy 2,000-pound payloads straight into the heart of the Third Reich. They dropped precision markers for the heavy Halifax bombers. They shattered Gestapo headquarters in daring low-level daylight raids. They systematically dismantled the German industrial machine without draining vital British aluminum reserves. They routinely operated at 30,000 feet. They suffered the absolute lowest loss rate of any Allied bomber in the entire Second World War. The Air Ministry officially stopped stamping loss due to pilot error on their casualty reports. The aircraft simply stopped falling out of the sky. In Berlin, Luftwaffe Commander Hermann Göring was entirely overwhelmed by the daily interception reports. German radar operators tracked the British bombers easily, cruising at 392 miles per hour. Germany possessed the massive Krupp steelworks. They possessed the greatest metallurgical forging presses in Europe. Yet Göring stood before his top aeronautical engineers and reportedly turned green and yellow with envy. He was shocked and furious that a British plane glued together by carpenters was effortlessly outrunning his most advanced interceptors. The heavy metal E700 horsepower Focke Wulf 190 simply could not catch the aerodynamically flawless timber sandwich design. Flight Sergeant Hastings never received a formal military medal for his midnight insubordination. He quietly returned to building high-end civilian furniture after the German surrender in May 1945. But decades later, aviation historians uncovered his 18-stamped yellow maintenance logs buried deep in the RAF Marham archives. The fragile paper records revealed exactly how a simple block of scrap wood and a tin cup of glue defeated the most advanced metallurgical war machine on Earth. In an era utterly dominated by heavy metal industrial engineering, the most elusive and advanced fast bomber in the sky was essentially flying wooden furniture. If you want more untold stories of the tiny mechanical details that shifted the balance of the Second World War, subscribe to the channel and let us know which historic aircraft we should cover next in the comments below.